All right. Let me just zoom in on my questions so I can read them a little bit better. All right. Welcome to the Poets and Philosophers Podcast. I'm Abe,
And I'm Sam.
and we respect the great tradition.
We're also brothers.
We talk about the great ideas and the Christian life.
If you love philosophy, old books, ancient ideas, and God, subscribe now.
Today, we discuss classical theism with our good friend Shane Scott. Hey, Sam, is there some way you can increase the volume of your mic? As I'm recording this, you can see my mic, my
Shoot.
audio
Check one,
levels.
two. Check 1, 2. Yeah, mine's
Yeah,
not
it's
even
just
being
not very.
recorded. Check
It
1, 2.
is, but just barely.
Is it recording through your earphones or through your blue, your ice snowball thing?
through.
Because it doesn't look like it's picking up through the snowball.
It says actually on Sam's thing, it says snowball. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So could you go into your audio settings, Sam, and just like boost the level of your mic volume? Here, I'm gonna hit stop. Today we're just talking with our good friend Shane Scott. Shane Scott is another one of those people who are really interested in the classics and what they have to say and reading old books. And so one of the questions I want to start off with, Shane, is maybe tell a little bit about yourself as well as what got you interested in the classics.
Well, first of all, let me say it's great to be with you guys. And to
I don't, Shane.
is my thing not doing it again? Here we go. I think it's working now.
What is
Testing
going
1,
on?
2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. I mean, I can see on my screen.
I can hear Shane.
I don't hear Shane. Maybe now.
Now testing 1, 2, 3. Testing.
Yeah, we're good. All right, just keep going.
Okay, great. So I'll just pick up from right there.
Yeah, I can edit it. That's
Okay.
fine.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you guys, to have this chance to talk about these things with you all. I live and preach in an area called Valrico, Florida, which is in the greater Tampa Bay area. And I was born and raised in central Kentucky, so I'm a big Kentucky Wildcats fan, which has been a cause of great lamentation this year in our college basketball season. But I taught for a few years at Florida College, and now I get to teach a lot of college students who come to church where I preach. So that's nice. It's like getting to teach in college without having to grade papers or give tests or anything like that. So that's a little bit about my background. And I got interested in the classics really through a very unusual and honestly tragic process. About 7 years ago, my wife, who had fought cancer previously, found out that her cancer had returned. And as you can imagine, that's a difficult thing to experience, and you start grasping and searching for answers. And almost just by accident, I happened to stumble across some resources that became a gateway to studying people like Thomas Aquinas and others from that tradition, and discovered not that all of my questions were easily answered, but that there were a lot better answers to questions I had had for a long time on offer than I ever realized until I plugged into that traditional thought. So that's kind of how it all kind of got started for me.
Wow, that's a really an amazing, but yeah, tragic way of getting into the classics. And it sounds like you've done a lot of reading in them. I know Aquinas is one of your favorite people to read from, and he's definitely one of mine. Every time I go back to him, I think of reading Aquinas, and I'm like, man, this guy really can talk. This guy really can answer questions in a way that I think is very helpful. The way he does it is really awesome. So the main thing we're talking about today is classical theism. And so the question I think it should ask here is just, what is classical theism, and how would a classical theist take issue with how people talk about God today? So two questions in one, but I think they kind of work together. A lot of times, you say, well, this is classical theism, and I think most people would go, oh yeah, that's what I believe. but bring it into tension
Right,
with how
right.
some people talk about God today, I think is pretty helpful. So go
Sure.
right ahead.
So classical theism is called classical theism for the same reason classical music is called classical music. We refer to classical music as classical because it's rooted in Western tradition and because it has achieved a level of appreciation and honor as a great example of music. So we call it classical music. And classical theism is kind of named for the same way. It's rooted in a very long tradition that stretches way back. Writers like Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas, you could call those the A team. They're the A team of classical theism. Um, and because it has a venerable reputation, kind of like classical music. So that would be sort of why it is called classical theism. And where classical theism sets itself apart from other views of God is in saying that sometimes our modern concepts of God are are too much like seeing God as just a bigger, better version of us. That he's almost like a character in a Marvel movie. He's like Thor. He's sort of like us. He's stronger. He's more powerful. But he has a background story like us, and he has limitations like us, and he has needs like us. And classical theism reacts very strongly against that view of God as quote unquote the man upstairs.
I think that's a really good way of explaining it. I think Thor maybe like a tough character, especially with the Marvel movies, because he's a really like a he's a brat like in the first one and kind of evolves as
Right.
it goes on. But like, maybe even I think like Superman, Superman is like he can do no wrong, but like obviously yes, there's like certain limitations that Superman has, particularly with kryptonite, as they wrote that in after that he was like too powerful. But yeah, I appreciate that
Now,
just
let me
how
just ask
yeah.
Yeah, let me just ask between the Peters boys, who is Thor and who is Loki here as I'm looking at you guys as we're talking today.
Oh, Sam is unbelievably Loki. The amount of mischief Sam got up to when he was a kid, is pretty legendary. Um, I think so. We were at camp. I'll tell this story. I'm only going to tell one of them because there's a bunch of them. But we were at camp, and Sam had a remote start business he had, which was really awesome. So he was putting remote starts in people's cars, which a lot of people would probably appreciate. Those who are experiencing this polar vortex, so you could start your car up, before you
Right.
walked out to it. And he put one in a black box, and he put a remote starter in the black box and put it underneath the counselor's cabin at camp. And so every morning he would walk by it and put the alarm for like 2 or 3 seconds and turn it off and then just keep walking. And no one had any idea this happened. That's like one thing Sam did as far as the mischief he got up to. So at that end of things, yeah, definitely. And I have a beard, so I think that's enough to say about Thor. That's the only way I really resemble Thor at this point. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's great.
that's what I would say there. But yeah, I think it's a good analogy though that God is almost like a superhero. Maybe back then we would say God is more like Zeus or like some of the other gods and the other places. But the classical theists, when they came to God and they studied him, they saw him in this much deeper and better way than the way that most people would talk about God today, even. So, what are some of those main features about classical theism that define God in certain ways that are helpful for us to understand?
Yeah, I think a great passage to use as a springboard for understanding how classical theism views God is Paul's statement to the people in Athens in Acts chapter 17, and particularly verses 24 and 25, where Paul says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." So that phrase, as though he needed anything, is a really profound statement about God. And it says a couple of things that are usually considered the hallmarks of classical theism. Number one, it says that God is not made up of parts. In other words, when you guys go buy a toy for your kids and the box on the front says some assembly required, that tells you that in order for that toy to be a toy, it needs two things. Number one, it needs the parts that are in the box that exist prior to the toy. And secondly, it needs someone to put those parts together, which I'm confident both of you would be much better at than me. So when something needs parts and needs someone to assemble them, obviously it can't be that which nothing is greater, because it's relying on something. It needs something else. But when Paul says that God does not need anything, what that is implying to us is God is not like the toy. God is not made up of parts, and he doesn't need someone to assemble him together to be God. So that's the first thing you could say about God, is that God is um, eternal, and he is immaterial. He's always been, and he's not made up of parts. Another thing you can say about God, based on that description, is that unlike an apple seed, for example, which has the potential to become an apple tree, but in order to become an apple tree, it needs something else. It needs the sun, and it needs soil, and it needs water. Or if I want to become a better basketball player, I may have some marginal potential to do that, but I'm going to need someone to train me to make that potential actual. In both of those instances, you have things that have potential, but in order for it to be realized, it needs something else. But if God does not need anything, then what that means is it's not like he's got a lot of potential if only someone could come along and give him what he needs to reach it. It would mean that God is already fully and completely God. Like the Army used to have an ad campaign that said, "Be all that you can be in the Army." So you have some potential that the Army could help you to realize. But what classical theism says is there is only one being who truly is all he can be, and he doesn't need anyone or anything else to help him be that, and that is God. So what that means is, unlike an apple seed, which can be improved, or unlike Shane, which maybe could be improved, God can't be improved. You can't make him better, and you can't make him worse. And the fancy way of describing that is that God is immutable, unchanging. But it's unchanging in the sense that he's already reached, he already is, rather, perfection. And so there's nothing that he needs to be more God than what he already is. And that kind of goes back even to Paul's statement here when he says, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. That's not the kind of being that God is. So once you start to think in terms of God as eternal and immaterial, and as immutable, unchanging in his perfection, you're on your way to what is usually called classical theism. And you can see how different that view of God is from Zeus or Thor, who have deficiencies, who have weaknesses, who have potentials, but they need other people's help to reach them. That's nothing like how God is described here in this passage.
Yeah, you've like hit on two major things there that classical theists hit on, as far as God as being simple, divine simplicity. I think is the term that's used, and that particular term, that God is not composed of parts, is like I think it's really hard for me, at least, to understand and wrap my head around. But once you kind of understand it, then it does begin to make a lot of sense. So I think, I don't know, I forget the order of our episodes that come out, but I'm pretty sure the episode 2 weeks ago, we talked about the soul, and and our souls have, different parts, and just how the Platonic soul discusses parts and stuff. With God, Um, let's say in hypothetical, God wakes up in the morning, like my analogy. God doesn't struggle with himself saying, should I hit the snooze alarm or should I not hit the snooze alarm? Should I get up or should I not? He doesn't have that internal conflict like we have that internal conflict. If he walks by a grotesque scene and he doesn't struggle, should I look? Should I not look? What should I do? And there's no deliberation inside of God. Like God just is, and everything he does not as a sort of reaction to things, but because he is that immutable characteristic. And I know philosophers are really do struggle with, and I think you've showed me some philosophers who deal with God and time being immutable, and I think it's a helpful um, discussion to have with thinking through God being somebody who is immutable but also acts in time, or the fact that how can God feel close to me if all he is like this giant, like he didn't even sound like a person at that point. I think what somebody would argue with, so if somebody would have said to you, Shane, well, at that point, God just sounds like the force. Um,
Right.
is that God? Is that God? Is he just like this thing that's out there that like doesn't change and it's almost like this great
Right.
he almost sounds like a substance and not a person at that point.
Right.
What would you say to
Yeah,
that?
no, that's a great question. And I would say a couple of things in response to it. First of all, the term divine simplicity, I remember the first time I heard that phrase, it sounded very weird to me because it's like God is greater than anything I can conceive. How could I call him simple? But it's simple in a very technical sense. It's simple as opposed to complex. And complex meaning made up of different parts, an assembly of parts. So divine simplicity says that God isn't made up of parts, like the computer is that I'm using, and that not only refers to physical parts, but it also means that God is not like 13% love, 11% holiness, 9% justice. And the reason that I think sometimes we struggle with this is because we are made up of parts, not only physically, but as you said, we often within ourselves feel a struggle or a tension. Uh, Sometimes our love is not holy, and sometimes our holiness is not loving. But on the other hand, we do have, even in the human experience, some sense of what this is getting at when we talk about God as not made up of parts, because we have a word like integrity, which means that a person is the same. That the character I have in private is the same character that I have in public. And of course, integrity is related to the word integration, as opposed to segregation, as opposed to someone who is different inwardly from what they are outwardly. So if you even think about the human beings at our best, are integrated beings. We are people where there's not a tension or division in between us. And as far as people thinking that the classical view of God makes God sound just like this force, this blob, what I would say is there are two ways that something could be unchanging. One could be like a gigantic rock that's on a hillside somewhere that just because it's incapable of doing anything just sits there. But the other way that you could be unchanging is if because you are already so maximally perfect, there's nothing greater that you could be. There's no dial higher than the dial that you are already at. And what classical theism says about God is not that God is unloving, um, or loves less than us. Quite to the contrary, what it says is that God is love, as John says in 1 John 4 and verse 8, and that God already loves us in a perfect way, and there's nothing we can do that could make him better at loving. He's already perfect at loving. And so classical theism doesn't give you a subpar view of God's love. It gives you the most maximally great view of God's love that you could possibly imagine. It says that God is loved by his very nature, and that in fact our existence is due to God's love. God has loved us into existence.
Yeah, I like that maximally great being way of thinking, because whenever we think about God and we think about things that make a being great, make a person great, even God is the best possible uh, display or being in that particular way. So we think about somebody who's personal, somebody who can talk to you, and when they talk to you, you feel like they're listening to you, and you feel like they're there with you. They're not like flipping on their phone or whatever it might be. Like they're with you, and God is the best possible form of him being with us. And so I think that once we think through that God is the greatest possible, whatever it might be, then he becomes more personal. So he's not like us, because if we have a conversation with us, there's a tension that it's all over the place, because you've got so many other things you could be focusing on. It could be early in the morning, so you could be hard to focus on things. You could have had just
Yes.
a really big meal.
Yes,
You could have a
yes.
really big meal, and you just got carb loaded, and so now it's like really hard to focus if it's in the afternoon. Whereas God, there's nothing that can happen to him that's going to take away his maximally great attributes, whatever it is, whether it's his holiness or his love or his presence with us. And I think that makes God bigger. Once I discovered classical theism and this idea of divine simplicity, and him being the technical term there would be pure act, um, then God has become exceedingly bigger than I thought he was, and I didn't realize it until I discovered classical theism. Sam, do you think that there's anything so far as questions that, as you're thinking through this, or anything new that's jumped out to you as you're working through all this?
Yeah, when we talk about divine simplicity, I think one thing that I think about is the Trinity and how it doesn't make sense how you said before that there's no tension in God. I see Jesus about to be crucified when he says, "Let this cup pass from me." I see great tension there between the will of his Father and his own, maybe not his own will, but at least the his flesh, you know, in excruciating, I guess, terror and whatever he was experiencing.
Hmm.
How do we understand divine simplicity, and yet that God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, there can be some kind of Godhead or Trinity, however you would want to call it. How would a classical theist um, rationalize that triune or that Trinity?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question, Sam. And there's a couple of things I think to say about that. First of all, it would certainly mean that it would be wrong to conceive of the Trinity as if God is one third the Father, one third the Son, and one third the Spirit. But it's kind of like, yeah, if y'all ever saw the movie Mars Attacks, but in the movie it's a comedy, and in the movie Martians Attack, and they wipe out Congress, and the president says, "Well, we've still got the Supreme Court and the presidency, and 2 out of 3 branches of government ain't bad." So it's not like you could lose the spirit and say, "Well, we've still got two thirds of God, so hey, we're." That would not be the right view of the Trinity. So what it does mean is that we have to be really careful about using analogies that draw from this world, that the creation, which is by its very nature uh, material, changing, and finite, and assume that we can therefore make a direct correlation to who God is. The prophet Isaiah in particular makes a big point about how you cannot ultimately compare God to anything in the created order. Think about like Isaiah 46, verse 5: "To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we may be alike?" Because all the frame of reference we all have as creatures is in the created order. And God, as Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 6, is holy, holy, holy. He's high and exalted. And so, what that means then is that as we strive to understand who God is, our frame of reference is fundamentally different than God. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't deduce truths about God, but what it means is that that language about God is always going to be sort of like, rather than exactly like language about God. So when we talk about the Trinity, that's why we have to be careful about using analogies that make God like an egg with three parts, or an apple with three parts, or a shamrock, because those are just going to be so flawed right out of the gate. And it also means that it's easier when you start to think about God to determine what he is not rather than what he is, because you can just simply eliminate. Think about when I started this podcast, we said he is not material and he is not changing, immaterial and immutable. So that's what we were doing, is we were saying, okay, if God doesn't need anything and everything in our creator order does, what are the differences? That doesn't mean though that we can't know about God, but it just means, like, if I say to Sam, like, Sam, hold up your finger right now. And I know those listening to the podcast, but he's holding his finger. All right, if I say, I see your point, I can mean two things by that. I can mean my eyes physically see your finger, and you can put your finger down now. Yeah. So I could mean I physically can see your finger pointing, or I could mean I grasp your idea. In the same words, I see your point, can mean two different and yet related things. We understand there's a relationship between those two statements, but one has to do with the physical level of vision, and the other has to do with the intellectual activity of grasping an idea. So our language about God is going to be like that. We can take language like I see your point, and we can understand about God things that are greater than the created order, but we do have to understand that's kind of our limitation as creatures. So when it comes to the Trinity, then this is a long way of answering your first question. It means that we have to be careful that we don't conceive of the Trinity in a way that makes it like a physical object, like all of those analogies. That's why the analogies are so challenging. And then, as far as Jesus and the crucifixion, the thing to bear in mind about Jesus is that, as John says in John 1, he is the Word made flesh. And in fact, one of the things that classical theism does for me is it heightens my appreciation of the incarnation. Because if you conceive of God as so fundamentally other than creation, in his simplicity and his immutability and his infinity, for him then to come into our created order in the way that he does in Jesus is a profound act upon his part. But what it does mean is that when it comes to the Word made flesh, there are all kinds of very unusual paradoxes that are now going to happen, which you would totally anticipate. The infinite now comes into time and space in a limited way. He was born in time and was made up of a physical body with limited, extension in space. It means that God, who neither sleeps nor slumbers, sleeps during storms. It means that God, who doesn't need anything, now needs food and needs shelter and needs something to drink. And it means the God who is eternal can die. So there are going to be many aspects of, as we consider Jesus, that give us these rich and profound paradoxes because of his unique nature as the Word made flesh. And so in classical theism, particularly those statements of Jesus on the cross, have to do with Jesus in his human nature facing the terrible death that he was about to face. But that's just one part, obviously a crucially important part of a much bigger package of very unusual paradoxes that come about because of who Jesus was.
Yeah, think about the incarnation being almost this whole other set of issues other than just thinking about God as a Trinity. Like once soon as we get to points of which we think about God being in the flesh, there's a whole host of these problems. You could say they're not problems for God, but they're problems for us to comprehend. And
Right,
whenever that
right.
happens, yeah, whenever that happens, oh yeah, yeah, exactly. And we can even talk about some of the books you would recommend for thinking through this particular issue. And I think the one I know you're already going to recommend is probably Forsaken by Thomas Cahill. And I was reading it, some of it preparing for this podcast. And he actually just takes the snapshot of Jesus on the cross saying certain things that he says and uses those as springboards, talking about the problem of how do we understand God. Like for instance, this problem of when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The title of his book, and how that relates to understanding God, even. And what I appreciate with that book is that he takes people who take a different view. Now, the other view besides classical theism, you said it beforehand, it was something like theistic personalism. Was that the right term?
Yeah, so that's like the most jargony of all jargonistic
Oh yeah,
terms,
I know.
right? So, but the idea is the other view, which would say that classical theism makes God sound like the force, impersonal. So the opposite of that would be personal, and so sometimes this view is called theistic personalism, which is just it does not flow trippingly off the tongue, as Shakespeare may say, but it's just the idea that we should conceive of God in more personal terms than what is found in classical theism.
Yeah. So this shift, though, I feel like there has been a definite shift between classical theism to this more theistic personalism. It's not everybody. I mean, before we were recording, we were talking about a few people who still believe this. I know um, Catholics as a whole believe typically in classical theism. And I would say possibly the Orthodox Church also believes that. So, two people we were talking about would be Edward Fazer, who is a Catholic philosopher. I highly recommend his books. And then also David Bentley Hart. I haven't read much of Hart, but I've read a few of his articles. He's got a way with words. I'll say that. Um, so so when did this kind of shift happen with from so
Yeah.
what are some like maybe some ideas that have developed that took this shift away?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I'm not enough of a historian of this kind of stuff to give a definitive answer. I think there are several different trends that kind of converge in this. One of them actually has its roots in an issue that you guys have talked about in talking about the soul and about what it is to be a human person. Um, and so you have a view like Plato, who sees the soul as something very much disjointed and disconnected from the body. And then you have Aristotle, who has a much more holistic understanding of what the soul is. But if you conceive of the human person as a soul that really has no bearing on a body, once you start with that conception, then you can see how maybe if a person can be a human being without a body, then maybe a person could be God without a body. And so then you start to make a connection between human personhood and divine personhood. In that way. So that's one of the trends that for centuries began to develop, especially with the rise of modern philosophy. But I really think, from my limited reading on this, that the other key issue is um, issues of tremendous human tragedy and suffering, like the Holocaust or like 9/11, which which make us long for a God who sympathizes, who's moved by our suffering and wants to help us. And that in turn then leads people to think, well, the idea of God as, this perfect being, um, we want a God who can be, touched with our sorrow. And so I think that also led to a shift. Now, I will say that again, I'm not much of a historian on this kind of stuff, but I think there's been a resurgence in classical theism because more and more people have the same interest that all three of us have, which is plugging back into this very rich tradition of really smart people thinking very hard about things that really matter for a long time. And so any groups that have by a creedal or confessional imperative, like in Catholicism or Orthodoxy, which very much is tied into early church fathers and stuff. Well, they are, of course, by definition, going to be classical theists because that's what classical means. But also, then, just for those of us who think we are rediscovering this great treasure trove of really good thinking that that needs to be explored and retrieved, then so I think there's been a bit of a revival in that.
Also, next, I think it's helpful too when we're talking about different ideas is to kind of give the best argument against it. So, let's say you're writing in the Aquinas way about things, and so you're going to begin with the other side, and you're going to say, "Well, I think theistic personalism is true because of what one or two or three." So, what do you think is some of the strongest arguments, or maybe the strongest argument against holding on to something like classical theism? I think Sam brought up a good point about the garden and the tension that was there with Jesus saying, "Let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thy will be done." I think that's a really good spot. Is there other ones too that you've thought of through this?
Yeah, I think the best argument that can be made against classical theism is that there are many passages of the Bible that speak about God in terms of if flaming in anger or being moved to love or any other kind of things like that that sound like personal emotional reactions to things like we as human beings have. And so those passages are taken to be examples of why classical theism is too indebted to Greek philosophy or too impersonal or what have you. And in fact, my most of my life as a student, that would have been the view that I would have taken for sure. Uh, but when I really started to be interested in classical theism, one of the things that I was reminded of is that the whole notion of our language about God being sort of like rather than exactly like is really important in this regard. For the same reason that when the Bible talks about the eye of the Lord, the mouth of the Lord, the arm of the Lord, the hand of the Lord, um, we understand that that doesn't mean that God has those physical organs or body parts. We understand that the Bible is taking language that we can relate to convey to us something that is true about God, but in a much greater way than it could ever be true about us when it talks about His Word, His power, His actions. And once I realized that, then for the very same reason that I would tell someone from the Latter day Saints that they are wrong to believe that God has had or has a physical body, because they're taking these passages and making them mean exactly like what they would mean for us about God, then by the same basic principle, I would say the same thing about those passages that are conveying to us something true about God, which is that He is perfectly loving, perfectly holy, perfectly just, but doing so in ways that we can relate to and understand. And one of the things about the book that you mentioned by Thomas McCall called Forsaken is he gives you a lot of examples of early commentators commenting on various passages who are making this very point. And one of the series of commentaries I have on my Logos package is the ancient Christian commentary series, and it's really I love to go back and read these guys partially because they see Jesus everywhere, and I like to see their ideas. But the other reason is because you can just see how people in the classical tradition are very serious Bible students. Thomas Aquinas himself was a great Bible expositor. He wrote many, many commentaries on books of the Bible. So they're taking the biblical text seriously, but you can also see the very nuanced way in which they understand a lot of these passages. And once, once in my mind, I was satisfied that you can be a very strongly biblical thinker and a classical thinker. You can do both of those. Once I was satisfied with that, then it helped to dissolve a lot of those arguments.
I do think that that is probably the best, is those passages like before the flood, God said he was sorry or regretted what he did, or Moses or the people, or God after the golden calf, before they continue on, God says, go on ahead, I'm not going to go. Then Moses pleads with God, and says, we couldn't go even without you. And God says, okay, I will go with you. And I think you think, all right,
Right. Yeah.
what is happening here? Can you change the mind of God? Or even, I think, the idea of prayer, as far as being able to change the unchangeable being, that doesn't seem rational. So how do you do that? But I think those are good answers to them.
Yeah. There's no question. And you know, when I said a moment ago that one of the things that has led to a denial of classical theism is human tragedy. I mean, I've heard people say, that Uh, it's easier for them to believe that God just didn't know that something like 9/11 would happen, rather than to believe this idea that God is eternal. So if you want to think about how does this debate affect how you believe in other subjects, and how it affects your doctrinal or theological beliefs in general, well, that's a huge difference when you start to say that, well, the way to deal with the problem of evil is just to say, well, God just didn't know it was going to happen. And in fact, it's interesting that the other kind of major theological system that took off after 9/11, the other two, where there's two others, one is atheism. All of the cottage industry of the new atheist books by Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins all came about after 9/11 because they saw this as Islamic terrorists are representative. That's what religion does for you. And then, of course, the other system is Calvinism. The new Calvinists, their rise in popularity is attributable to 9/11 because, again, in their mind, it's easier to imagine that God just predetermined that this would happen rather than to think that human freedom could cause such harm. And in contrast to all of those ways of thinking, I think the classical theistic view is it's expressed in the story of Joseph, when Joseph says to his brothers at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 50, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. That classical theism says that God sees what real free human choices will do. But because God's power and wisdom are so far above ours, he incorporates those into his plan, and then he brings out even greater good as a result of them. So that would be one issue where you could really kind of delineate how these different views of God kind of stack up and take shape. It also heightens your appreciation for Jesus, because while God in his nature does not, we cannot do anything to make God suffer in his perfect joy and blessedness. Jesus, who was a human being, could suffer, and he could suffer in tears of anguish at the tomb of Lazarus. He could suffer in tears of weeping over the fate of Jerusalem. He could suffer in the garden as he contemplated his own death. And and so this heightens our appreciation of who Jesus was, and why God sent him. So if you read a book like Athanasius on the incarnation, Athanasius is he's another A-team member, so he's right in that tradition, but he writes one of the most moving books about the incarnation and the purpose of it, and what God has done in Jesus Christ. So those would be some examples of issues that come into play with this.
Yeah, I second reading Athanasius on the Incarnation, especially the little introduction there by C.S. Lewis about reading old books. It's very good.
Yes.
We've referenced it before on the podcast, and that's definitely an essay worth reading, along with Athanasius as he treats the Incarnation. I try to read that once a year. It's a pretty small volume, so I think it's worth reading at least once a year just to refresh those wonderful ideas he presents there. So with classical theism, maybe somebody's like, hey, I want to know more about it, or maybe you're trying to show someone that this is something you should definitely take seriously. What are, you think, some of the better arguments, or even just books that'll help you jump into this whole school of thought and this whole like world of way of seeing God? What are some ways they could do that?
Yeah, that's great. Well, you mentioned the writer Edward Feser. His name is spelled Feser. It was actually his book called The Last Superstition, which is really his response to the new atheists, and is written in a pretty snarky tone because you could tell he's kind of ticked off with these guys and their snarkiness. So if you can get past that, that was like my gateway into all of this. And then there's a book that I would recommend to all Christians to read called The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. So Tozer was a devotional writer, and what he does in this book is each chapter he focuses on a different attribute of God. But Tozer is certainly coming from this classical tradition, but he does so in a way that's easy to understand, that's very biblically oriented, and it's another one of those books I kind of wish I could have written, because he's making what can be very profound theology very accessible and relatable to anybody who wants to read it. So I would actually, if this is kind of all new to somebody, I would start with a book like Tozer's book, which just kind of goes through the attributes of God from this vantage point.
Yeah, those are good. So we've got possibly the last superstition, but maybe start off with the knowledge. You said the knowledge of the
The
holy.
Knowledge of the Holy, yes, by
Yeah, start with
A.W.
that one
Tozer.
maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah, A.W. Tozer. I have not read that, so I think I'm going to pick that one up. That sounds like a good book to read.
yeah,
Uh, Forsaken by Thomas. You said McCall. I think I said Cahill last
McCall.
time or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Yeah,
That's why it's one of those
McCall. Yeah,
Scotch Irish names. They're all the same.
yeah, right. So that's a really good one. And then the Last Superstition. I think those are three good books to jump into. I've read two of those, so I would definitely recommend them. And then Sam, do you have any other last questions or something that's pondering as you're kind of thinking through all this to think through, or anything like that?
By how we don't really know that much about God. I know that's probably an exaggerated stance because I see that there's there's a continuum here. On one extreme, there's someone who talks about God in human terms only, and then the other extreme that looks at God as some principle or force. I think there should be a balance, and I think that generally I see God in human terms. And for me, I think classical theism is going to help me balance my view of God. I know right now I'm preaching through Isaiah, and that's a huge theme, that God is holy, holy, holy. And also in Isaiah 45, verse 15, it says, "Truly you are a God who hides himself, God of Israel, Savior." So that's not, you are a God who is hidden. You are a God who hides himself. That means God is purposeful in hiding himself. That's huge. So when we look in the world and we don't see God, we can see evidence of him, but we don't see him. We need to respect that. And that is something that I think classical theists are doing very well. They're coming to terms with the hiddenness of God, that God has purposefully hid himself, that we can only talk about him in about terms, and similarities. There's some, with every similarity, there's going to be some dissimilarity, but then also, some, I guess, uh, unification. Just some just anything with metaphor, there's going to be some unification. I think that's how they call it. But anyways, it's just, that is something that I think is very helpful, and that's where, if we really do believe that God is hidden, and when God becomes man, and there's so many paradoxes that follow, that we need to say God is not like us. And when I realize that, my faith is strengthened. One, because I know that, um, you know, I guess a lot of people I'm around, I would say even our culture, looks at God as some, very personal person who, is just a person blown up. If he's not necessarily like that, and I can't really think according to his thoughts unless he reveals it himself, and even when he reveals it, it's going to be in terms only that I can understand it. God becomes so much bigger, and for me, that's helpful. That brings, that's sublime. That instills a little bit of tension in myself, and I stand before God rather than I stand beside him and I'm working together with him. That's helpful to me, and that's something that I think classical theism, if I think if you are on the extreme of personalizing God, then I think classical theism should be something you become interested in.
And let me just tag in here to make one point in connection with what you just said, Sam. Think about in Isaiah 55, the Lord says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts." So that's the side of the equation that says God is fundamentally higher and other than. But in the preceding two verses, he says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found, call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon for my thoughts." So, what Isaiah is saying is, we as human beings, we like to think, oh, so and so would never forgive me, because we have these flawed, segregated, conflicting, aspects to our personality. But the very point Isaiah is making when he says God is far above us is, he will forgive you when you think he won't, because his ways and how he thinks is different than you. But that is the reason you should draw near to him. So I would just use that as my final pitch to see that a classical theist view of God should not make us think of God as less loving or forgiving. To the contrary, it should make us see that he is the most loving and forgiving that we can imagine, and then times infinity.
Yeah, that's good. I That verse about God being higher than our doing things that are above us. A lot of times I see that verse come out whenever we actually try to talk about God. It's almost like this shield that comes up to saying, well, we really shouldn't talk about the nitty-gritty of God and divine simplicity and all that, because after all, his ways are his ways are higher than our ways. And the verse says, "Seek the Lord." I think that what part of what I want this episode to really even say is that those of you who are listening is to take seriously to understand God as best as you can in a humility and in a humble way, because there are obviously going to be limits. God does indeed hide himself. There are aspects that we will never even know existed. There are, like, I forget who said it, but there are those known unknowns, but also there are the unknown unknowns. There are things that we don't know about God and his ways. And when we understand all of that, but God, at the end of the day, still calls us to know him and to seek him and to understand him. And that should be part of our daily contemplation, is to seek him and to understand him. Because whenever we have these problems, like for instance, Sam is saying, well, classical theism may make some people think that God is less personal than he is. Like that right there, we should automatically think that's actually not right. God is more personal. I just don't understand what it means to be more personal yet. Or uh, this sort of way makes God seem unloving. It's like, no, you don't understand yet what it means to be loving. And it is by contemplating God's presence and contemplating God's lovingness that we actually begin to adopt the terms in which God lays forth to us, saying, this is what it actually means to be loving. And I think that has to change, because the word love is one of those words that's thrown around a lot, especially by the songs we write about God or the songs we write about ourselves, that we have to recapture God's term of what it means to love. And I think it's through studying scriptures, as well as those who've studied scripture, who've come along and wrote some things that are worth reading again, that we get to do all of this. Shane, it was really good to talk through all this with you, and we'll definitely have to have you on again to talk about some other concept about the classics and stuff, and about God. Those who are listening, we really do appreciate you listening to this podcast. We would appreciate if you gave us a review on iTunes. This is on iTunes. Those really help get other people out. And if you would share this with your friends and let them know that there's a podcast that we talk about God and the classics and great ideas, we would really appreciate that. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you guys in the next one.